The cold hangar echoed with cruel laughter as Marcus Blackwood pointed at the small, dirt-covered girl hiding behind the helicopter. "Fly this machine, little beggar, and I'll give you everything you've ever dreamed of," he sneered, never expecting what would unfold next. But no one imagined what would come next. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn wind cut through the massive aircraft hangar like a knife, carrying with it the distant hum of jet engines and the acrid smell of aviation fuel. Marcus Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Aerospace Industries, strode confidently across the polished concrete floor, his $1,000 Italian leather shoes clicking in perfect rhythm. At 32, he commanded an empire worth $3 billion, and every step he took radiated the kind of arrogance that only unlimited wealth could breed. His perfectly tailored charcoal suit, crafted by London's finest tailors, fit his athletic frame like a second skin. Dark hair slicked back with precision, steel-grey eyes that missed nothing, and a jaw that could cut glass. Marcus embodied everything the business world both feared and envied. Today's meeting with potential investors from Japan would secure his latest military contract, worth $800 million. "Mr. Blackwood, the delegation will arrive in 20 minutes, announced his assistant Patricia, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. The hangar housed 6 of his company's most advanced helicopters, each worth more than most people's homes. "Excellent. Make sure the champagne is properly chilled. These investors appreciate attention to detail," Marcus replied, adjusting his platinum cufflinks. He glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, a graduation gift to himself when he'd taken over his father's company and doubled its value within 2 years. As he moved toward the center of the hangar where the crown jewel sat, the prototype Blackwood Phoenix, his latest military helicopter design, something caught his eye. A small movement near the landing gear of the aircraft. Marcus frowned, his perfect day suddenly interrupted by an unwelcome distraction. "What the hell?" he muttered, walking closer to investigate. There, crouched behind the massive tire of the helicopter, was a child. A girl, no more than 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair that hadn't seen a proper washing in weeks. Her clothes were little more than rags. A faded pink t-shirt with holes, jeans torn at the knees, and sneakers held together with what looked like electrical tape. Her face was smudged with dirt and oil, but her eyes were the most striking blue Marcus had ever seen, alert and intelligent despite her circumstances. "Security!" Marcus bellowed, his voice bouncing off the hangar walls. "How did this street rat get in here?" The little girl didn't run. Instead, she stood up slowly, her small frame barely reaching Marcus's waist. She looked up at him with those remarkable blue eyes, showing no fear, despite being caught trespassing in a restricted military facility. "I'm sorry, mister," she said softly, her voice carrying a maturity that seemed impossible for someone so young. "I was just watching the pretty bird." "Pretty bird?" Marcus scoffed, his face twisting into a cruel smile. "This pretty bird cost $47 million, you little vagrant. Do you have any idea what you're looking at?" The security team arrived, 3 large men in dark uniforms, all looking embarrassed that a child had somehow breached their supposedly impenetrable perimeter. "Sir, we have no idea how she got in," the head of security, Thompson, stammered. "We'll remove her immediately." But Marcus held up a hand, a twisted idea forming in his mind. The Japanese investors would be here soon, and perhaps a little entertainment before the serious business began wouldn't hurt. He'd always enjoyed demonstrating his superiority over those less fortunate. "Wait," Marcus said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "I have a better idea." He crouched down to the little girl's level, his expensive cologne a stark contrast to her unwashed appearance. "What's your name, little beggar?" "Sophie," she replied quietly, her eyes never leaving his face. Well, Sophie, do you know what this machine does? Sophie nodded slowly. It flies like the angels my mama used to tell me about. Marcus's smile grew wider, more predatory. That's right, it flies. And do you know how to fly, little Sophie? She shook her head, but something flickered in her eyes. Something Marcus was too arrogant to notice. Of course you don't, Marcus continued, standing back up to his full height of 6'2". Flying requires intelligence, training, years of education. It requires breeding. It requires being born into the right family with the right opportunities. The little girl's hands clenched into tiny fists at her sides, but she remained silent. Marcus turned to his security team and the small group of employees who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Gentlemen, I have a proposition for our little trespasser here. He gestured grandly toward the helicopter. Sophie, I'm going to make you an offer that will change your pathetic life forever. If you can start this helicopter, just start it, mind you, not even fly it, I will personally adopt you. You'll live in my mansion, eat the finest food, attend the best schools. You'll never be hungry or cold or dirty again. The crowd murmured among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable with Marcus's cruel game, but none dared speak up against their powerful employer. But when you fail, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, you'll leave this place and never come back. Security will make sure of that. Sophie looked up at the massive helicopter, its sleek black and silver body gleaming under the hangar's bright lights. The Phoenix was Marcus's masterpiece, equipped with the latest in military technology, twin engines capable of producing over 3,000 horsepower, and flight systems so complex that only the most experienced pilots could operate them. Do we have a deal, little Sophie? Marcus asked, extending his hand with mock formality. Sophie looked at his manicured hand, then back at the helicopter. For a moment that felt like an eternity. She said nothing. The only sounds in the hangar were the distant rumble of aircraft and the nervous shuffling of feet from the gathered crowd. Finally, Sophie reached out with her small, dirty hand and shook Marcus's. Deal, she said simply. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or kindness. This should be entertaining. Thompson, clear everyone back to a safe distance. We don't want anyone hurt when this little performance inevitably goes wrong. As the crowd moved back, Marcus pulled out his phone to record what he was certain would be a humiliating failure. The Japanese investors would arrive soon, and he could regale them with the story of the presumptuous street child who thought she could fly. Sophie walked slowly toward the helicopter, her bare arms thin as twigs, her small feet making no sound on the concrete floor. When she reached the aircraft, she placed her tiny hand on the landing gear, the same spot where Marcus had found her hiding. Any last words before you embarrass yourself, little girl? Marcus called out, his phone camera focused on her small frame. Sophie turned back to look at him, and for just a moment Marcus thought he saw something different in those blue eyes. Not fear or uncertainty, but something else entirely. Something that made him feel inexplicably uneasy. My daddy always said that angels don't need permission to fly, Sophie said softly. Then she grabbed the door handle and pulled herself up into the cockpit. The helicopter's cabin enveloped Sophie like the embrace she hadn't felt in 3 years. The rich leather seats, still bearing the new aircraft smell, were larger than any chair she'd ever seen. But it wasn't the luxury that made her heart race. It was the familiar layout of switches, dials, and displays that she'd memorized from countless nights spent hidden in shadows, watching, learning, dreaming. Marcus stood outside with his arms crossed, his phone still recording, anticipating the moment when the little girl would break down in tears and admit her foolishness. The gathered crowd whispered among themselves, some placing bets on how long it would take before Sophie gave up. Patricia, make sure you're getting this on video too, Marcus instructed his assistant. "I want multiple angles of this humiliation." Inside the cockpit, Sophie's small hands moved with unexpected purpose. She adjusted the pilot's seat as far forward as it would go, her legs still barely reaching the rudder pedals. But her eyes were scanning the instrument panel with an intensity that would have surprised anyone watching closely. The central display showed the helicopter's system status. Sophie's finger traced over the multifunction displays, reading information that should have been incomprehensible to a 7-year-old street child. But hidden beneath her tattered clothes was a mind that had spent 3 years absorbing every detail of aviation from her secret observation post at the airport. "Master battery switch," she whispered to herself, locating the red-guarded switch on the overhead panel. Her thin arm stretched to reach it, and with a click, the helicopter's electrical systems came to life. A collective gasp arose from the crowd outside. Even Marcus's smug expression faltered slightly. "Lucky guess," he muttered, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Sophie's movements became more confident. She knew this aircraft. She'd watched Marcus and his test pilots fly this exact helicopter dozens of times from her hiding spots around the airport. Every pre-flight check, every startup sequence, every emergency procedure had been burned into her memory during those long, hungry nights when sleep wouldn't come. The fuel pumps activated with a low hum. Sophie checked the fuel quantity indicators, noting the nearly full tanks. Her small fingers found the engine start switches, but she paused, remembering something important. "Engine area clear!" she called out in a voice much stronger than anyone expected. What did she just say? Thompson, the security chief, asked nervously. She's following proper startup procedures," replied John Martinez, one of Marcus's senior pilots who had been watching from the crowd. "That's the standard safety call before engines start." Marcus whirled around to face Martinez. "That's impossible. She's a street beggar." Nah, but Sophie wasn't finished. With practiced precision, she engaged the starter for the number 1 engine. The turbine began its familiar whine, building in pitch and intensity. Within seconds, the massive rotor blades began their slow rotation, cutting through the air with increasing speed. The sound was deafening in the enclosed hangar. Marcus had to shout to be heard over the roar of the engine. "Turn it off! Turn it off now!" But Sophie couldn't hear him. She was lost in a memory, transported back 3 years to a different aircraft, a different time. She could almost hear her father's voice. "Remember, Princess, the helicopter wants to fly. Your job is just to let it." Udi, the second engine, came online with a deep, powerful rumble. Both engines now operated in perfect harmony, their combined power making the entire aircraft vibrate with barely contained energy. The rotor system reached operating RPM, the blades now invisible as they sliced through the air. Outside the aircraft, the crowd had moved even further back. The incredible noise and the powerful downdraft from the rotors made conversation impossible. Marcus stood frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand, watching in absolute disbelief as a 7-year-old girl completed a startup sequence that took trained pilots months to master. Sophie's hands moved across the controls with muscle memory that defied explanation. She checked engine parameters, adjusted the collective pitch, and tested the cyclic controls. Every movement was purposeful, controlled, precise. But then, as quickly as it had begun, the miracle ended. Sophie's small hand reached for the engine shutdown switches, and one by one, the mighty turbines wound down. The rotor blades gradually slowed their rotation until they hung motionless once again. The sudden silence in the hangar was deafening. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The only sound was the gentle ticking of cooling metal and the distant rumble of traffic outside. Then Sophie opened the cockpit door and climbed down from the helicopter. Her movements were slow, almost reluctant, as if leaving the cockpit caused her physical pain. When her feet touched the concrete floor, she turned to face Marcus with those extraordinary blue eyes. "The pretty bird is sleeping again," she said softly. Marcus stood speechless, his mouth hanging open. Around him, his employees stared in shock. Some pulled out their phones to confirm what they'd just witnessed. Others simply stood frozen, trying to process the impossible thing they'd just seen. "How?" was all Marcus could manage to say. Sophie looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd discovered her, she smiled. It was a sad smile, filled with memories and loss, but also with a quiet pride that reached something deep inside Marcus's chest. "I told you, mister, my daddy taught me that angels don't need permission to fly." "Your daddy?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse from shouting over the engines. "He was a pilot," Sophie said simply. "The best pilot in the whole world. He used to take me flying every weekend, said I was his little co-pilot." The pieces began falling into place in Marcus's mind, but he wasn't ready to accept what they meant. What happened to him? Sophie's smile faded, replaced by a look of profound sadness that no child should ever have to carry. "He and Mama went flying without me one day. They said they'd be back for dinner, but they never came home." "When was this?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. 3 years ago, when I was 4. Sophie's voice grew even softer. "The airplane broke in the storm. They went to heaven to be with the angels, and I came to live at the airport so I could be close to them." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. 3 years ago. He remembered that storm, remembered the news reports of a small private aircraft that had gone down in severe weather. A family of 3, the reports had said, but he'd assumed. "What was your father's name?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Captain James Mitchell," Sophie said proudly. "He flew for American Airlines for 15 years before he started his own company. He had his own airplane and everything." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Captain James Mitchell. He knew that name. He knew it because 3 years ago, Captain Mitchell had been negotiating a contract with Blackwood Aerospace, a consultation deal that would have brought Mitchell's expertise in civilian aviation to Marcus's military projects. The meeting had been scheduled for the week after Mitchell's death in that storm. Marcus staggered backward, the full weight of what had just happened crushing down on him. This wasn't just any street child. This was the daughter of one of the most respected pilots in the industry, a man Marcus had personally wanted to hire, and he had just made her homeless daughter perform like a trained animal for his amusement. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted his spiraling thoughts. The Japanese investors had arrived, their black SUVs pulling into the hangar area. But Marcus couldn't focus on business right now. He couldn't focus on anything except the little girl standing before him, looking up at him with eyes that held no accusation, no anger, only a deep, abiding sadness. "Sophie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I think we need to talk." But the moment was shattered by Patricia's urgent voice. "Mr. Blackwood." "The Yamamoto delegation is here." Marcus looked from Sophie to the approaching investors, his mind racing. The biggest deal of his career was walking through those hangar doors. And here he stood, his entire world turned upside down by a 7-year-old girl who could fly his helicopters better than some of his trained pilots. "Thompson," Marcus called to his security chief, never taking his eyes off Sophie. "Take Miss Mitchell to my office. Get her something to eat, something to drink. Make sure she's comfortable." "Miss Mitchell," Thompson repeated, confused by the sudden formal address. "Just do it," Marcus snapped, then forced himself to shift into business mode as the Japanese delegation approached. As Sophie was led away, she turned back once to look at the helicopter. For just a moment, Marcus saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. It was the look of someone saying goodbye to a dream they'd never be allowed to have again. But Sophie Mitchell had already proven that impossible dreams sometimes do come true. And Marcus Blackwood was about to learn that some promises, once made, can never be taken back. The business meeting that followed was a blur of handshakes, technical specifications, and contract negotiations. But Marcus couldn't concentrate. His usual sharp focus was shattered, his thoughts constantly drifting to the small girl waiting in his office. The Japanese investors, led by the impeccably dressed Mr. Yamamoto, seemed impressed with the Phoenix helicopter's capabilities, but Marcus found himself explaining features with mechanical precision, while his mind remained elsewhere. The Phoenix represents the pinnacle of military aviation technology, Marcus heard himself saying, going through the motions of his carefully rehearsed presentation. Twin Pratt & Whitney turboshaft engines, advanced avionics suite, and defensive capabilities that make it virtually unstoppable. Mr. Yamamoto nodded appreciatively, taking notes in rapid Japanese characters. Most impressive, Blackwood-san. We are particularly interested in the pilot training requirements. Such advanced technology must require exceptional skill to operate safely. The irony of the comment wasn't lost on Marcus. Exceptional skill, like the skill demonstrated by a 7-year-old girl who lived on the streets. After what felt like an eternity, the meeting concluded with preliminary agreements and promises of further negotiations. Marcus shook hands, exchanged business cards, and made all the appropriate diplomatic gestures. But the moment the delegation's vehicles disappeared from view, he practically ran toward his office. The executive suite occupied the entire top floor of the Blackwood Aerospace building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the airport and the city beyond. Marcus burst through the door to find Sophie sitting in one of his leather chairs, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized furniture. She'd been given fresh clothes, a simple blue dress that Patricia had somehow procured, and her face had been cleaned, revealing delicate features and skin that spoke of good genetics despite months of malnutrition. She was eating a sandwich with careful, measured bites, as if she wasn't quite sure the food was really hers to have. When she saw Marcus, she immediately stopped eating and started to stand up. "Please sit," Marcus said quickly, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "Finish your food." He took the chair across from her, studying her face in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Clean, she looked even younger than 7, but those remarkable blue eyes held wisdom and pain that belonged to someone much older. "Sophie," Marcus began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. He'd built an empire by being decisive, by knowing exactly what to say in any situation. But sitting across from this child, he felt completely lost. "Thank you for the sandwich," Sophie said softly, "and for the dress. It's really pretty." The simple gratitude in her voice made Marcus's chest tighten again. When had he last felt genuine gratitude from anyone? His world was filled with people who wanted something from him, who treated kindness as a transaction. But this child, who had every reason to hate him, was thanking him for basic human decency. "Sophie, I need to ask you some questions," Marcus said. "About your father, about what happened to you after the accident." Sophie nodded, setting down her sandwich. "Okay, tell me about that day, the day your parents died." Sophie's eyes grew distant and Marcus immediately regretted the bluntness of his question. But she answered with a composure that broke his heart. "It was a Saturday. Daddy was supposed to take me flying, but Mama said I had a little cold and should stay home with her instead. They were going to meet some important people about Daddy's new business." She paused, her small hands folding in her lap. "Daddy kissed my forehead and said when he came back, we'd do barrel rolls in the clouds." Marcus had to look away. He remembered now. Captain Mitchell had been flying to meet investors for his new aviation consulting firm. The same firm that Marcus had wanted to partner with. "What happened after?" he asked gently. "Child services came and took me to a place with lots of other kids who didn't have families. But it was scary there, and the big kids were mean to the little ones. So one night, I climbed out a window and came to the airport." "You've been living at the airport for 3 years?" Marcus asked, horrified. "Not exactly living," Sophie corrected. "More like hiding. There are lots of good hiding spots where people can't see you, and I learned that if you're very quiet and very careful, you can watch the pilots without them knowing. But how did you survive? Food, shelter, clothing?" Sophie's matter-of-fact response revealed a survival instinct that should never have been necessary in a 7-year-old. "The cafeteria throws away lots of good food at the end of the day, and there are warm places in the maintenance buildings when it gets cold. Some of the cleaning ladies were nice to me, but they didn't know I lived there." Marcus felt physically ill. While he'd been building his fortune, attending charity galas and complaining about trivial inconveniences, this child had been surviving on scraps and hiding in shadows, all because the system had failed her. "But the flying," Marcus pressed. "How did you learn so much about aircraft?" For the first time since he'd cleaned her up, Sophie's face brightened with genuine enthusiasm. "Daddy taught me the basics when I was little. He said I was a natural, but after I came to the airport, I watched everything. I hid in the maintenance hangars and watched the mechanics work. I learned about engines and hydraulics and electrical systems." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the runway where aircraft took off and landed in the distance. "But mostly, I watched the pilots. I memorized their pre-flight checks, their radio calls, their emergency procedures. Every type of aircraft has different quirks, but they all want to fly. You just have to know how to ask them nicely." The childlike phrasing of such sophisticated knowledge was both heartbreaking and amazing. "Sophie, what you did today." Most trained pilots couldn't have done that without a checklist. She turned back to him with a sad smile. "Daddy always said I had aviation fuel in my veins instead of blood. He said someday I'd be the best pilot in the world." "What was his dream for you?" "He wanted to teach me everything. Airplanes, helicopters, maybe even jets someday. He said we'd fly around the world together, just the two of us, having adventures." Sophie's voice grew wistful. "He was saving money to buy a bigger airplane so we could take long trips, somewhere warm, where Mama could get better." "Your mother was sick?" "She had something called lupus. Daddy said the cold weather made her hurt more, so he wanted to move somewhere sunny, but then—" Sophie's voice trailed off. Marcus felt a crushing weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This child wasn't just a random street orphan. She was the daughter of a man he'd respected, a man whose expertise he'd wanted to hire. In some cosmic sense, Captain Mitchell had been coming to work for Marcus when he died. "Sophie," Marcus said carefully, "when I made that challenge in the hangar, when I said I'd adopt you if you could start the helicopter, I was being cruel. I never expected you to succeed." "I know," Sophie said simply, "but you promised anyway." The words hit Marcus like a slap. She was right. He had promised in front of witnesses, with cameras recording. He'd made the offer as a cruel joke, but she had met the challenge with impossible grace and skill. "Yes," Marcus said slowly, "I did promise. My daddy always said a man's word is the most important thing he owns," Sophie said, turning back to the window. "He said once you give your word, you can't take it back, no matter what." Marcus stood up and joined her at the window. Far below, his empire spread out before them, aircraft hangars, office buildings, manufacturing facilities. Everything he'd built, everything he'd achieved, suddenly felt hollow compared to the simple wisdom of a 7-year-old girl. "Your father was right," Marcus said quietly. "A promise is a promise." Sophie looked up at him with those remarkable blue eyes. And for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of hope there. Not the desperate hope of someone begging for scraps, but the cautious optimism of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment, but couldn't quite stop believing in miracles. "Does that mean—" Sophie began, then stopped herself. "It means I keep my word," Marcus said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "If you want it, Sophie Mitchell, you have a home." The smile that broke across Sophie's face was like sunrise after the longest night. Pure, radiant, transformative. In that moment, Marcus realized that making this little girl smile might be the most important thing he'd ever accomplished. But as he looked down at her hopeful face, he also realized he had no idea how to be a father to anyone, let alone a traumatized 7-year-old genius who could pilot aircraft better than his trained employees. The real challenge was just beginning. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered what other surprises Sophie Mitchell might be hiding beneath her remarkable abilities. Outside the window, a helicopter traced lazy circles in the autumn sky, and Marcus could have sworn he saw Sophie's lips moving in silent communication with the distant aircraft, as if she were having a conversation with angels only she could hear. 3 weeks had passed since Sophie Mitchell officially became Sophie Blackwood, and Marcus was discovering that legally adopting a child was far easier than actually raising one. His sprawling mansion in the exclusive Beacon Hill neighborhood, with its 12 bedrooms and palatial grounds, had never felt more empty despite having a small person running through its halls. The house staff, his longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, the groundskeeper, and his personal chef, had embraced Sophie with an enthusiasm that surprised Marcus. Mrs. Rodriguez, in particular, had taken the little girl under her wing, teaching her Spanish words while braiding her newly styled golden hair each morning. But it was the evenings that challenged Marcus most. After spending his days making multi-million-dollar decisions and commanding respect from world leaders, he found himself utterly bewildered by bedtime routines, homework assistance, and the simple act of having dinner with another person. Tonight was no different. Marcus sat in his formal dining room, designed to impress business associates with its crystal chandelier and mahogany table that could seat 20. Sophie sat at the far end, her small frame dwarfed by the elaborate setting, picking at her carefully prepared meal. "How was school today?" Marcus asked, the same question he'd posed every evening for 3 weeks, always receiving the same polite, minimal responses. "Fine," Sophie replied, not looking up from her plate. Marcus had enrolled her at Pemberton Academy, the most prestigious private school in the city. The tuition alone cost more than most people's annual salary, and he'd expected Sophie to be thrilled with the opportunity. Instead, she seemed to grow more withdrawn each day. "Your teacher, Mrs. Harrison, called today," Marcus said carefully. "She mentioned you've been quiet in class." Sophie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I answer when she asks me questions. But you don't participate in group activities. You don't play with the other children during recess." Sophie finally looked up, those remarkable blue eyes meeting his across the vast expanse of polished wood. "They don't like me." "What do you mean, they don't like you?" "You're smart, you're kind, They know I'm different," Sophie interrupted softly. "They know I used to live on the streets. Emma Hartwell told everyone her daddy said you only adopted me for publicity." Marcus felt his jaw clench. Richard Hartwell ran a competing aerospace company and had always resented Marcus's success. The fact that he was poisoning children against Sophie made Marcus's blood boil. "Sophie, listen to me," Marcus said, standing up and walking around the table to kneel beside her chair. "Richard Hartwell is a small, petty man who's jealous because his company can't compete with mine. His daughter is just repeating lies her father tells at dinner." Sophie studied his face with that unsettling intensity she sometimes displayed. "But am I just for publicity?" The question hit Marcus harder than any business rival's attack ever could. Was she? Had he adopted Sophie to look good, to soften his ruthless public image? The honest answer was that he didn't know anymore. What had started as a cruel game had evolved into something he couldn't define. "No," he said finally, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "You're here because you earned it. You flew that helicopter better than pilots with decades of experience." "But I can't fly here," Sophie said quietly. "I asked Mrs. Rodriguez if we had any airplanes, and she said you don't let anyone else fly your helicopters." Marcus felt a stab of guilt. In 3 weeks, he hadn't once thought about Sophie's passion for aviation. He'd focused on schools, clothes, doctor's appointments, all the practical aspects of suddenly having a child. But he'd completely ignored the one thing that made Sophie's eyes light up. "Would you like to fly again?" Marcus asked. For the first time in days, Sophie's face brightened. "Really? You'd let me?" "Well, maybe not solo," Marcus said with a small smile. "But I think it's time I saw exactly what Captain Mitchell taught his daughter." Indeed, 2 hours later, they stood together in Marcus's private hangar at the airport. This was different from the corporate facility where they'd first met. This was his personal collection, housing 3 aircraft, including his favorite, a Robinson R-44 helicopter that he used for quick trips around the region. Sophie stood transfixed, her small hand pressed against the aircraft's sleek blue and silver fuselage. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "Her name is Serafina," Marcus said. "She's been my personal aircraft for 5 years." "Serafina," Sophie repeated, rolling the name around her tongue. "That means burning one in Hebrew. Like an angel of fire." Marcus stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Daddy taught me about angels. He said every aircraft has its own guardian angel, and if you know its name, you can ask for protection during flight." The casual way Sophie blended practical aviation knowledge with childlike spirituality both charmed and unsettled Marcus. There were depths to this little girl that he was only beginning to discover. "Would you like to see inside?" Marcus asked. Sophie nodded eagerly, and Marcus helped her climb into the pilot's seat. Immediately, her posture changed. Her back straightened, her hands found the controls with natural precision, and that look of intense concentration returned to her face. "Pre-flight check," she murmured, her small fingers moving across switches and displays with practiced efficiency. "Master battery, fuel pumps, engine parameters." Marcus watched in fascination as Sophie conducted a perfect pre-flight inspection entirely from memory. She called out each item in the proper sequence, her young voice taking on the professional cadence of an experienced pilot. "She's ready to fly," Sophie announced, then looked up at Marcus with hopeful eyes. "Can we, please?" Marcus hesitated. Taking a 7-year-old up in a helicopter wasn't exactly standard parenting procedure, but then again, nothing about Sophie was standard. "Have you ever flown as a passenger?" Marcus asked. "Hundreds of times with Daddy. He said I was his best co-pilot." Marcus made a decision that would have horrified any child psychologist, but felt absolutely right in the moment. "Okay, but I'm pilot in command, and you follow my instructions exactly. Deal?" "Deal!" Sophie's excitement was infectious. 30 minutes later, they were airborne, Boston's skyline spread out below them in the gathering dusk. Marcus handled the controls while Sophie sat in the co-pilot seat, wearing a headset that was comically oversized for her small head. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked through the intercom. "Like coming home," Sophie replied, her voice filled with wonder as she watched the city lights beginning to twinkle below. They flew in comfortable silence for several minutes, the helicopter's gentle vibration and the rhythmic whopping of the rotor blades creating a cocoon of peace around them. Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "Marcus?" Sophie's voice came through the headset. "Yes?" "Thank you for keeping your promise." Marcus felt that familiar tightness in his chest. "Thank you for believing I would." As they banked toward home, Sophie pressed her face against the window, watching the airport approach. "Marcus?" "Yes," "Sweetheart." The endearment slipped out without conscious thought, and Marcus realized it was the first time he'd used it. "I think Daddy and Mama can see us up here," Sophie said softly. "I think they're happy I found you." Marcus's throat constricted, making it difficult to respond. "I think they are too," he managed. But as they descended toward the landing pad, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something Sophie wasn't telling him. Something important about her past, her capabilities, or her connection to aviation that went beyond even what he'd already discovered. The truth, when it finally came, would change everything he thought he knew about the little girl who'd flown into his life. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 month after Sophie had moved into Marcus's mansion. Marcus was reviewing quarterly reports in his home office when Mrs. Rodriguez knocked urgently on the door. "Mr. Blackwood, you need to see this," she said, holding a manila envelope with trembling hands. "What is it?" Marcus asked, looking up from his financial projections. "I was helping Sophie organize her new room, and this fell out of that old backpack she carried from the streets. She was taking a shower, so she doesn't know I found it." Mrs. Rodriguez handed him the envelope with obvious reluctance. It was weathered and worn, the kind of deterioration that came from being carried and handled for years. Sophie's name was written on the front in a man's careful handwriting. Marcus's stomach clenched as he recognized the lettering style. He'd seen Captain James Mitchell's signature on the contracts they'd been negotiating before his death. Inside the envelope were documents that made Marcus's hands shake as he read them. Flight logs in James Mitchell's handwriting, documenting over 200 hours of dual instruction given to Sophie Mitchell, co-pilot trainee. The entries began when Sophie was 3 years old and continued right up until the week before the fatal crash. But it was the final document that stopped Marcus's heart entirely. A formal recommendation letter, dated just days before Captain Mitchell's death, addressed to the Federal Aviation Administration. In it, James Mitchell requested that his daughter Sophie be considered for an expedited evaluation for her private pilot's license upon reaching the minimum age requirement of 17. The letter detailed Sophie's exceptional abilities, perfect scores on written aviation exams designed for adults, demonstrated proficiency in both single-engine aircraft and helicopters, and an intuitive understanding of aviation that surpassed most professional pilots. Most shocking of all was the final paragraph. "My daughter Sophie has logged over 180 hours of actual flight time under my direct supervision. She has successfully completed night flights, instrument approaches, and emergency procedures. In my professional opinion, she is already a more capable pilot than many licensed aviators I have flown with during my 20-year career." Marcus sank into his chair, the papers scattered across his desk. Sophie hadn't just learned to fly by watching from hiding places. She'd been an actively trained pilot since she was barely old enough to walk. "There's more," Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly, producing a small digital camera from her apron pocket. This was in the backpack too. Marcus turned on the device and began scrolling through hundreds of photos and videos. His breath caught as he saw image after image of a younger Sophie in aircraft cockpits, her small hands on controls, her father beside her with an expression of pure pride and joy. One video made Marcus's chest tighten painfully. It showed 5-year-old Sophie successfully landing a small Cessna aircraft, while her father provided calm guidance through the radio. Her concentration was absolute, her movements precise, and when the aircraft touched down safely, her father's voice could be heard saying, "Perfect landing, Princess. You're going to be the best pilot who ever lived." "How long has she been hiding this?" Marcus whispered. "I think she's been afraid you'd send her back to the streets if you knew how much she'd been lying," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "Children who've lived through trauma often hide their most precious possessions." Marcus looked up sharply. "Lying? What do you mean? She didn't learn to fly by watching Mr. Blackwood. She already knew how to fly when you found her. That start-up sequence she performed wasn't beginner's luck. It was the skill of someone who'd been flying for years. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sophie had been homeless and alone for 3 years, but before that, she'd been receiving professional flight training from one of the best pilots in the country. She hadn't just survived on the streets, she'd continued learning, probably practicing on flight simulators whenever she could sneak access to them. She could have taken any aircraft at that airport, Marcus realized aloud. She could have flown away any time she wanted. But she didn't, Mrs. Rodriguez pointed out. She stayed close to the aircraft because they reminded her of her father, and maybe because she was waiting for someone who would understand what she could do. Marcus heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly gathered the documents. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her hair still damp from her shower, wearing the simple clothes she preferred over the expensive outfits Marcus had bought her. "What are you looking at?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus held up the manila envelope. "I think you know." Sophie's face went pale, but she didn't run or make excuses. Instead, she walked into the office and sat in the chair across from Marcus's desk, her small frame straight and dignified. "Are you going to send me away?" she asked quietly. "Sophie," Marcus said gently, "why didn't you tell me you were already a trained pilot?" Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Because every time I told people what Daddy taught me, they said I was lying. The people at the children's home said it was impossible. They said I was making up stories to get attention." Marcus felt a surge of anger at the adults who had failed this remarkable child. "So you decided to hide your abilities? I thought if I showed you I could learn fast, you might let me stay long enough to—" Sophie's voice trailed off. "Long enough to what? Long enough to matter to someone again?" Sophie whispered. The words broke Marcus's heart completely. This little girl, who possessed skills that professional pilots spent years developing, had been so desperate for a home that she'd hidden her greatest gifts because she was afraid they'd be used as evidence against her. "Sophie," Marcus said, moving around the desk to kneel in front of her chair, "you matter to me more than any business deal I've ever made. You matter more than any aircraft I've ever built. You matter because you're brilliant and brave and incredible, not in spite of it." Sophie looked into his eyes, searching for signs of deception. "Really? Really? And I have a proposition for you." "What kind of proposition?" Marcus smiled, feeling more certain about this decision than any he'd made in years. "How would you like to become the youngest certified pilot in aviation history?" Sophie's eyes widened. "You mean it? You'd help me get my license?" "Help? I mean, we're going to rewrite the record books together. But first, I want to see exactly what your father taught you. Tomorrow morning we're going flying, and this time you're going to show me everything." Sophie launched herself into Marcus's arms with such force that she nearly knocked him over. For the first time since her adoption, her embrace felt completely genuine, unguarded, trusting. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for not sending me away." Marcus held her tight, marveling at how this small person had become so essential to his life in such a short time. "I'm never sending you away, Sophie. We're family now." But even as he made that promise, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie's revelation was only the beginning. If a 7-year-old could hide professional-level flight training for a month, what other secrets might she be carrying? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and it would test everything he thought he knew about trust, family, and the price of keeping promises. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect flying weather that made Sophie bounce with excitement as they drove to the airport. Marcus had arranged for them to use the training aircraft, a dual-control Cessna 172, that would allow him to take over if necessary, while giving Sophie the opportunity to demonstrate her true capabilities. As they completed the pre-flight inspection together, Marcus watched Sophie's movements with new understanding. Every check she performed was textbook perfect. Every procedure executed with the confidence of someone who'd done it hundreds of times before. "Ready?" Marcus asked as they climbed into the aircraft. "I've been ready for 3 years," Sophie replied, adjusting her headset with practiced ease. What followed was the most remarkable hour of flying Marcus had ever experienced. Sophie didn't just pilot the aircraft, she danced with it. Her movements were intuitive, graceful, and precise beyond anything Marcus had imagined possible for someone her age. She executed perfect takeoffs, flawless navigation, and approaches that would have impressed veteran instructors. When Marcus asked her to demonstrate emergency procedures, she responded with calm professionalism that belied her 7 years. "Emergency descent for engine failure," Marcus called out, testing her knowledge. Without hesitation, Sophie reduced power, established best glide speed, and began scanning for suitable landing areas while running through the emergency checklist from memory. Her radio call was clear and professional. "Mayday, Mayday, simulated engine failure. Cessna 47X requesting priority handling for emergency landing." Marcus was speechless. This wasn't just competent flying, this was exceptional piloting that surpassed many commercial aviators he knew. As they leveled off after the simulated emergency, Sophie turned to him with those remarkable blue eyes. "Marcus, can I tell you something important?" "Of course, sweetheart." "The day Mama and Daddy died, they were flying to meet with you." Marcus's hands tightened on the controls. "What do you mean?" "Daddy had been working on a big contract with your company. He was so excited because he said working with Blackwood Aerospace would let him spend more time with me and Mama. He could stop traveling so much for the airlines." Marcus felt the world tilting around him. "Sophie, are you saying he was coming to sign papers to work for you?" Sophie continued, her voice growing softer. "He said once he was part of your team. He could teach other pilots about safety procedures. He wanted to make flying safer for everyone." Marcus's throat constricted as the full weight of the cosmic coincidence hit him. Captain Mitchell hadn't just been another pilot seeking employment. He'd been coming to join Marcus's company as a safety consultant, bringing his expertise and his passion for aviation excellence to Blackwood Aerospace. And he died on his way to that meeting, leaving his daughter orphaned and alone. "Sophie," Marcus said carefully, "how long have you known who I was?" "Since the first day at the airport. I recognized your name from Daddy's business papers. But I was afraid that if you knew, you'd feel bad about what happened and send me away because I reminded you of something sad." Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time in years. This remarkable little girl had been protecting his feelings while living on the streets, afraid that her connection to her father's tragedy would cost her the only chance at a home she might ever have. "Oh, sweetheart," Marcus whispered, "you could never remind me of anything sad. You remind me of everything good about your father, his skill, his passion, his dedication to excellence." "Really? Really? And I have something to tell you too." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your father was going to be my partner, Sophie. We were planning to build a whole new division of the company focused on civilian aviation safety. His expertise, combined with our resources, could have saved thousands of lives." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Would you still want to do Daddy's safety project? I know I'm just a kid, but I remember everything he taught me about what makes flying dangerous. Maybe someday I could help finish what he started." Marcus looked at this extraordinary child and felt something shift permanently in his chest. She wasn't just asking to continue her father's work. She was offering to dedicate her life to making his dreams a reality. "Sophie Blackwood," Marcus said formally, "I would be honored to have you as my partner in continuing your father's legacy." The smile that broke across Sophie's face was radiant enough to power the aircraft's electrical systems. Partners. Partners, Marcus confirmed. But first, we need to get you officially certified, and I think I know exactly how to do it. 3 months later, Marcus stood beside Sophie on the tarmac of Boston's Logan International Airport as a crowd of reporters and aviation officials gathered around them. At 7 years and 8 months old, Sophie Blackwood was about to become the youngest person in aviation history to receive a special waiver for pilot certification. The FAA had initially balked at Marcus's request, but after witnessing Sophie's abilities firsthand and reviewing her extensive training logs, they'd agreed to create a special provisional license that would allow her to fly under supervision until she reached the standard minimum age. "Are you nervous?" Marcus asked as they watched the officials set up for the ceremony. "A little," Sophie admitted. "But Daddy always said nerves just mean you care about doing something right." Marcus squeezed her small hand. He was right about that too. As the ceremony began, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed. The man who'd once measured success only in dollars and deals now found his greatest pride in watching a little girl achieve the impossible. Sophie stepped forward to receive her certificate, and as the photographers captured the historic moment, Marcus heard her whisper something under her breath. "Thank you, Daddy. I kept my promise to keep flying." In that moment, Marcus understood that Sophie hadn't just found a home with him. She'd brought her father's dreams home too. And together, they would make sure those dreams took flight and soared higher than either James Mitchell or Marcus Blackwood could have achieved alone. The little girl who'd started as a cruel challenge had become the most important thing in Marcus's world. And the best part was, their story was just beginning. As they walked away from the ceremony hand in hand, Sophie looked up at him with those remarkable blue eyes. "Marcus?" "Yes, Princess, I love you too." Marcus realized she was right. He did love her, with a completeness that had transformed him from a cold businessman into someone capable of putting another person's happiness before his own. Some promises, Marcus had learned, don't just change lives, they save souls. And sometimes the smallest angels carry the most powerful wings.